Good morning. Now that, normally on day two, the initial response is much better than it was on day one, but that was way, way worse. So let's do this all over again. Good morning. That was actually awesome. I think we had some contribution from the people in the queue for the cloakroom out here as well. That's how good that was, so thank you. We are a bit late starting this morning. Thank you for your patience. The reason is not what you might expect. The water, I'll come to the water in a second. The reason is that we have lots of people turning up with bags on the second day and the cloakrooms are struggling slightly. So I'm kicking off slightly late. Our keynote will start off at 9:35, but then we'll be back on track, finish at 10:40 and into the conference. So what about the water yesterday? Goodness me, if you watched the news, you will know that, if you're local to London, you'll know what I mean when I say the Goldhawk Road and Shepherd's Bush. If you're not local to London, let me just say that the local area was without water yesterday. And those roads in that area were actually underwater with a burst main. But Thames Water worked overnight. The water is flowing locally, and our conference is literally back on stream. For all of my 19 years of introducing learning technologies, I don't think I've ever given an announcement that's been greeted with more happiness than that one. But I just want to take my hat off to Olympia, because seriously, in a building this size, you cannot run it without sprinklers. They did a great job keeping us running yesterday, and so I just want to say thank you very much to them. Now, there were just a very short couple of bits of housekeeping, then I want to ask you a question, as always. First bit of housekeeping is, if you haven't got onto Jamie's bot, which we're calling the Learning Technologies chatbot, but we should also call it the Reflect bot, because its job is to help you reflect on learning technologies and what's going on, then please do so. It's a learning experience for all of us. It's also for Jamie. Jamie is going to build it up and is going to add to the bot over time, and it's going to, I hope, be something we use at events in the future. So if you've not got onto it, I had a chat with him last night. He was very pleased with how it's gone so far. Then please get onto the bot and make sure that you're using that as a sort of aid memoir. When you get back to the office tomorrow and all those emails have to be dealt with, the bot is there to help prompt you and say, you know, you thought about this and you were thinking about that. Please carry on putting that into action as you go forward, rather than just getting subsumed beneath work. Okay, so that's the first piece of housekeeping. The second piece, of course, is Learn Appeal, our charity that we support, which, in the memorable phrase of Leslie Price, provides e-learning without the internet and possibly even without electricity. Is being piloted, if you'll remember from yesterday, in Kenya and also in the Highlands of Scotland in the next couple of weeks. They're looking for support in any way, in cash, in kind. If you can provide some effort that will help them do a good job with that. It's taken 3 years to get to this pilot stage, and they deserve your support going forward. H13 is the stand to visit downstairs. H13 Learn Appeal, and just go and see if you can pitch in, offer your support in helping people who otherwise might not be able to get online, and help do your bit in reducing the digital divide. That would be great. All right, so we've got the bot, we've got Learn Appeal. It's time for the question. Very quickly then, I want you to turn to your neighbour. I was very struck with how we dealt yesterday, or actually not so much us on the organising staff, but the people at Olympia dealt with the catastrophe of not having water. And I thought, well, what would be the catastrophe that could hit us, any of us in our work, over the course of the year, and how would we deal with it? And the big issue that I know a lot of organisations are dealing with is obviously budgetary cuts. Actually, some organisations are putting more money into L&D, great. But what would happen if your budget was suddenly cut by 80% tomorrow? What would you do about it? How would you react? What would your step be that you would say, well, I simply cannot do that thing anymore, and I'm going to do this instead? And I say this because I know organisations that have gone through this and have transformed what they do, bizarrely, for the better. As a result of that. I'm not suggesting you go to your boss and volunteer for an 80% cut in your budget, but how would you transform your business if suddenly you only had 20% of your funding? I say your business, I mean your department, whatever you're doing. Okay, it's not an attempt to be downbeat. What I want to do is to think about radical ways of how you deal with your resources. So what I'd like to do is to turn to your neighbour, if you have a choice, someone you know, someone you don't know, turn to the new person, introduce yourself. How would you deal with a new approach to learning, which involved only 1/5 of your resources, if you had to do that tomorrow? And we'll do that for 2 minutes, we'll get some quick feedback, and then we'll get going. Go ahead. I think what we'll do is we'll just stop the rest of the conference and we'll just stay in the room having a conversation, because it's clearly what people actually want to do, isn't it? Thank you very much, that's great. Okay, loads of great thought, loads of excitement and buzz. Right, what would you do? What would you change? Any thoughts? What would you change if you had to? All these, I'd never know if people are like, brushing their hair or a bit shy. What thoughts? Say again?
Change the decision. Give me my 80% back.
Well, actually, yes, you might find yourself being much more assertive in your discussions with management, and there wouldn't be anything wrong with that, and I think actually there's a lot to be said for L&D generally being a lot more bolshy. I'd go further, I'd say give me 80% back and another 80%, for goodness sake. All right, raise the stakes. Anything else? Reduce face-to-face, which is, I'm not bashing face-to-face, but is incredibly costly. Go online. And also, I mean, people I know who've done this have said, rather than be a course production facility, we become a facilitation area and have actually helped the managers do the business of producing courses themselves. And said, not simply, we're not sure, do you want to, but no, we don't produce courses anymore. We'll start from that basis and then see what you do. And it transforms what L&D does. Any other extraordinary ideas? Yes?
I don't know how extraordinary it is, but it's just user-generated content.
Oh, let's hear it. User-generated content. Yes, it's not extraordinary, but there's loads of it there. Go on.
Well, it could be in lots of forms. So you can still have face-to-face, so you could do
Yes.
watch and learns.
Yes.
Or you could do podcasts or just videos, just very simple, but just use the expertise you've got internally.
So much of the value that we have in organizations, in any knowledge economy, is what's in people's heads. And bizarrely, we too often try to funnel that through this bottleneck of the L&D department, when in fact, of course, what we can be doing very effectively is facilitating conversations, podcasts, ways of people sharing between each other. No, it's not extraordinary. What's extraordinary is that we're not doing it, absolutely. I totally agree. Yes? Say again? Self-learning. Yeah, so give people the opportunity to go and learn for themselves. And bizarrely enough, when this happened in a local London borough here, that's exactly what happened. One of the great resources you've got in a borough is you have all the libraries available to your staff, and people can get books for free. Bizarrely enough, that's one of the things they used very effectively. Okay, any final points on what you might do?
Mentoring.
Say again?
Invest in mentoring.
Go on, tell me more about mentoring.
Just use the experienced, knowledgeable, competent staff that you have to teach, to direct, to transfer internal good practice.
I love it. Actually, one of the things we don't do nearly enough of, isn't it, is, again, spreading good knowledge. But it's not just the knowledge and information, but also with mentoring so much more as well. Showing people the way, mindsets, helping people understand different ways of approaching problems. And yes, fantastic. There's so much we can do with that. And we don't, again, have to be the hub. We put people together. We become a dating service that matches the mentor and the mentee together. I was a bit worried about that question. Usually, I try to be all upbeat, especially on the second day. What wonderful thing is going to happen to you over the next 12 months? So saying, what would you do if your budget was cut, is a bit of a downbeat way to start the day. But thank you for rising to the challenge and coming up with some great answers and thoughts. Time for me to move on and introduce our keynote speaker and get cracking. Yesterday, we had a great look at the future with Rohit Talwar, but as always with learning technology, the clue is in the title. We tried to have a bit of technology on one day, bit of learning on the second day. What better way to start the second day than the guy who wrote Amazon's Science Book of the Year, if that book happens to be called Learn Better. So I'm delighted to introduce to our stage a guy who has spent a considerable amount of time putting together the different bits of research around learning in a very practical way that as individuals or as leaders, we can help inform our practice. And of course, he's used it to inform his own practice of learning, whether he's learning how to improve his basketball, whether he's helping his kids do the homework, or whatever. He himself has learned and is learning how to learn better. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ulrich Boser. Okay, I'm just going to now cough for 5 minutes while Ulrich's opening up.
Thank you so much for being here. I have a little confession to make. It's embarrassing. You see, I drive all the time. Just about once a week, I get behind the wheel of a car. I started driving in high school. I was 17 years old when I learned, and since then, I'd say I've driven about 100,000 miles or so. But here's the thing. I have not gotten better at driving. I still have trouble parallel parking. I still have difficulty kind of going into the curves. I'm not in high school anymore, right? I don't have pimples. I don't listen to bad 80s rock. But how exactly to move into the curves, how exactly to brake properly is still beyond me, right? And it's not just driving. Handwriting is the same thing, right? I've started to learn how to write when I was in elementary school. I write a note just about every day, a note to my kids, a message in a meeting. And here's the thing about my handwriting. It's actually gotten worse over time. Question is, how is this possible? How is it possible to spend literally tens of thousands of hours on something and not get any better? So this question has really long fascinated me. Since I was a little kid, that's me in 4th grade, and I really had a hard time learning. I repeated kindergarten. I spent some time in special education. In one 4th grade class in January of 1982, I managed to get into trouble for not being able to answer simple questions. I couldn't do some division. I was chattering away with my colleagues. I was paying attention to a computer in the back of the class. I know all of this because there was a psychologist in the back of the room just sort of sitting there, back here, just kind of writing notes about all the ways that I was unable to learn. So eventually I went off to college. I had the benefit of some good parents, some good schools, but it really fascinated me. How do people learn? How do we think about education? How can we improve education? And since college, I've been researching education, figuring out what are the ways that we can learn more effectively. And what I've discovered more recently is that a lot of the conventional wisdom on learning is wrong. So a lot of people believe in learning styles, right? That some people are visual learners, some people are audio learners, right? No evidence for that. Often see people using highlighters or rereading. Very little evidence for those practices. But then on the other side, there are practices that kind of seem a little bit weird, like talking to yourself, but are highly effective. So I wrote a book on this topic. I'm not going to talk about that as much as just sort of 10 principles that I think are incredibly important when we think about learning, when we think about our own learning, how we can learn, as well as when we think about instructional design and rolling out more effective learning programs. So we're going to run through these. The very first I have here is make meaning. Right? That learning itself is this very active process. Right? It is something that we need to understand. We need to engage. I think so many of us think that learning often is sort of like our brain's like a computer. Right? There's information that comes at us, and we sort of file it away in bins and boxes. But that's not how it works. So to give you an example, not long ago I went to go visit a professor in Florida, Bennett Schwartz, and he asked me a pretty straightforward question. What's the capital of Australia? Actually, let's do this. How many people believe that the answer is this is what happened to me? He said, what is the capital of Australia? How many people believe the answer is Sydney? If you could raise your hand, that would be great. And I'll explain in a moment. It's very important that you actually commit to an answer. So Sydney? Do we have any takers for Sydney? Melbourne? Got a couple of people for Melbourne. Canberra? Great. I had no idea that the answer was Canberra. I'm actually going to go so far as to say I had never even heard of Canberra before. In fact, I'm up here, I'm still not even sure that I'm pronouncing Canberra correctly. There's lots of fun questions like this in this research literature called the hypercorrection effect. If you believe something to be true, right? If you would have asked me before Bennett Schwartz had asked me, what is the capital of Australia? I would have been like, oh, sure, I know the answer to that. And then you're shown to be wrong, right? You're much more likely to remember that information in the future. All sorts of examples of this. They're fun questions. What does the Immaculate Conception revolve around? They're very culturally based, right? Because you both have to be confident in the answer, right? And then shown to be wrong, right? So Immaculate Conception, many people believe that it revolves around Jesus. Turns out that that's not true. It's all about Mary. Mary herself needs to be born without sin. But the important thing to take away here, right, is that this idea that we make an error, and the bigger error that we make, the more that we learn. Right? This shows, for one, that the brain is not like a computer, right? A computer, of course, if it makes an error, it would not be functioning. Right? But it really, this idea of hypercorrection is this idea that we need to pause, we need to understand, we really need to engage in order to learn. And we don't need to make mistakes either. So explaining something to yourself, right, is a highly effective way to learn. Just simply quizzing yourself, what people talk about as retrieval practice, right? Huge body of literature goes behind this idea. Or explaining something to someone else. Again, a much more active, effective way to learn. And when you think about why the fact that I never got better at driving, right? This idea helps it because most of the time when you drive, you're sort of sitting there, you're thinking about your boss, you're thinking about your kids, right? You're not actively engaged in that learning. This is my one research slide that I have up here. But I want to stress how effective this practice is. So this is a simple slide. This is a study done by Jeff Karpicki, and basically gave people some material to learn. And then he had the subjects study once. So this is like most of us in college, right? You read the textbook once, maybe, and then you sort of put it away. You have repeated study. So you have individuals who read the material once, and then they read it a second time. Great. Concept mapping. And then retrieval practice in this far slide here, far bar. And these individuals read the material, closed the book, and then just wrote down everything that they knew. We often think about retrieval practice or kind of this type of low-stakes quizzing or explaining something to yourself or someone else as something that's important for low-stakes, or low-level kind of factual knowledge. But this slide is actually the assessment here was measuring real deep understanding of the material that they read. We can use this in all sorts of ways. I've started to use this a lot more even in my own life. With my direct reports, I engage in repeat backs. This is a common management technique. You give someone instructions, you ask them to just simply repeat it back. I now use this with my wife as well. She tells me, hey, you should pick up the kids, get the groceries, and I repeat it back. This works because it is an active form of learning. So again, our first takeaway here, first big principle, make meaning, and ways to do that: testing yourself, explaining to yourself, explaining to other people, summarizing that material. Second principle is the blessing and the curse of knowledge. So if I haven't made it clear, I really like testing. I really like quizzes. And so we're going to have a little bit of a sort of game quiz here together. This is a humming game. It comes from a book by the Heath brothers. And this is what I'd like you to do. Think of your favorite song. Okay. It can't be Happy Birthday. Right. And it can't be, God Save the Queen. It can't be an incredibly sort of, God Bless America. I'm assuming that that's not going to be the song here today. And so if I had a partner here, if Don was my partner, I like Frank Sinatra, I'd be like, which is Strangers in the Night. So if you could just take a minute, and both partners could hum to each other would be great. We're going to come back in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I know there was a lot of humming. I heard it. I'm going to call on Susan here. She's going to hum for us for a moment here. Susan? So once the mic went away, Susan said, "That's embarrassing." The point of this exercise, I play with my kids a lot, is that it's incredibly hard to guess the song, but you hear it so clearly in your own head. Whether it's me humming Frank Sinatra or Susan humming the Beatles, right? You hear it in your own head. It's crystal clear. You hear the drums or the Frank Sinatra's voice, and yet you watch the other person. You're like, how is this possible? They don't get this song. They should know this song. The important takeaway here is that thinking, learning, is infused with knowledge. Right? The way that we think is really embedded in the content, in the things that we know. So this makes knowledge a curse. Right? So often I'm just going to let you look at this for a second. So often we use acronyms or jargon, and we assume that the people that we're talking to know exactly what we're talking about, right? You know, here in this room, UK, I feel like we're probably on the same page of what it stands for. I'm, as I've already made clear, at least in my accent, from the US, and so UK stands for the University of Kansas. And it's funny, I came up here to talk about the curse of knowledge, and I've given the speech a number of times, and usually I tell people, not to sing, American songs, right, like the Star-Spangled Banner, and I had to think to myself, wait a sec, this crowd isn't possibly going to sing that. The point here is that the curse of knowledge is with us all the time. It is so hard to get out of our own heads and think about what is the learner actually thinking? What is the person that we're engaging with? What do they know? What do they don't know? And that is this curse of knowledge, and it happens to us all the time, right? When we're using any type of analogy, I'm in the US, so I'd say, a politician might be the Steph Curry of sports. If you don't know who Steph Curry is, arguably the best basketball player in the NBA right now, you guys should really know this. In the US, the flip side, right? I might say someone is the Ronaldo of sports, and I really draw very similar sort of blank stares. What's important here, though, is that knowledge is also a blessing. Ask this quiz question, best predictor of learning, age? Could you raise your hand, please, if you think it's age, A?
Sorry, can I ask, what do you mean by the question?
So if Don is the student, what is the best way that I can predict whether or not he's going to gain this information, right? So if I want to teach him about coffee, types of grinds, beans, what is the best way for me to predict whether or not Don is going to know this information? So since we think in terms of the concrete rather than the abstract, we're going to use Don here as our sample student.
Once again.
So Don wants to learn about coffee. Should we say, age is the best predictor of whether he's going to learn that material or not? Anyone voting for A? Just raise your hand. You won't hurt Don's feelings, by the way, if you do vote for A. Learning style, B. Some votes for learning style. Prior knowledge. Great, we've got a lot of hands for prior knowledge and personality. This is really a vote for Don, incredible charm here.
Thank you.
The answer here is prior knowledge. What you know is the best predictor of what you're able to know in the future. And the reason is knowledge. So often I'm in events such as these where people will argue, you know it, you don't need to know content anymore. It's all in your phone, Google away. We don't need to really learn that material. Memorization is, of the past. It's like a stagecoach. It's a technology that we don't need anymore. And I'm here to tell you that that's wrong. My favorite example is, haben Sie heute Morgen gefrühstückt? Which is German for, have you eaten breakfast this morning? You can Google each of those words on your phone immediately, but unless they're fluent, right? Unless they come top of mind, it is very, very hard to be fluent in German. So again, this principle, what is the curse and blessing of knowledge? Third is honor short-term memory. Gonna have another quiz here. The question is, how much data can you store in working memory, the brain sketchpad? A, 1 item. Raise your hand for that. Anyone for 1 item? This is a tough crowd here. B, 3 to 5 items. And then more than 5 items. So for a long time, researchers thought that it was more than 5 items. We look at the history of telephone numbers. This is the history of telephone numbers in the UK. I myself did on the flight over here get out of the curse of knowledge. Usually this slide is about telephone numbers. In the US, though, interestingly, very similar. When they first rolled out telephone numbers, they thought about the research and said, we're going to base telephone numbers in places and numbers. So if you lived in Wimbledon or you lived in London, you would have some information around that area and then some digits attached to that. Then researchers, this was in the 1950s, thought that short-term memory was around 5 to 7 items. And so that's why we have numbers like the area code 020 and then 3141 1945. But now what we've realized is that even those numbers are too much. They overload our short-term memory, and so we're not able to fully engage. So if you've ever had that experience where you're trying to call into a conference line and you're supposed to remember that code and you cannot, your brain is perfectly normal. This happens to all of us. This is a built-in feature of how we think, how we learn. And that helps us also understand why companies, like the telephone companies, have realized that if you really need to know something, it needs to be very, very short. And that's why we have emergency numbers 911 in the US, 999 here, 3 digits. The takeaway for us is don't overwhelm short-term memory. If you're giving a PowerPoint presentation, keep those slides very simple. When you're trying to engage students, bring it down into chunks. One of the benefits of knowledge is that it actually allows us to expand our short-term memory. You can see this actually in the second number. The 3141 is actually the first 4 digits of pi. If you know the 4 digits of pi, it's easier to remember that. It comes in one chunk. If you know the date in which World War II ended, you can chunk 1945 into a single bit of information. Point here, don't overwhelm short-term memory. We do it all the time. We do it to ourselves. This helps us understand also why we can't multitask. Why, in many, many studies, it's been shown that listening to music while engaging in high-level tasks is not effective. Right? Why having people have access to the internet in lectures is a great way to bring down student achievement. My favorite, actually, study on this fact is that they were able to show in a university classroom that not only the person, so if Susan has her computer open here during a lecture, she would show lesser levels of achievement, but you can also actually see it in the person sitting next to them, right? So if your colleague is constantly checking Twitter, that is itself its own drag on short-term memory, and you yourself, even though you don't actually have the computer open in front of you, show less understanding, less learning. So our fourth principle here is think about thinking, what researchers often call metacognition. Do you know how a toilet bowl works?
Yes.
Right? If you are thinking about this now, you are engaged in metacognition. And if you're sort of confident that you were like, oh, I kind of know how a toilet bowl works. The water here was off yesterday. We know what happens. I'd like you to turn to your colleague just for a moment and explain how a toilet bowl works.
Okay.
It's going to do that
You've got
for
a
2 minutes.
U-bend. Right. You've got a U-bend, and the water finds its...
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. People are overconfident. People are incredibly overconfident about their overconfidence. I didn't do a survey in the room. You guys were answering a lot of these quiz questions correctly. But on average, people say, yeah, I know how a toilet bowl works. Turns out, and this probably happened to you, that they're a lot more complicated than people think. So there's sort of the filler valve, there's the siphon at the bottom, right? This helps us understand also, right, these kind of weird things about toilet bowl that you were never really sure about, like if there's just a little bit of water, it doesn't flush, but you put in a lot of water and it flushes. What I encourage you to think about here was to think about your own thinking, right? To reflect, okay, so how much do I know about a toilet bowl? I use them quite a bit, right? So I'm kind of familiar with, how they work, but could I explain it to someone else? Most often, we become stuck. It's fun actually standing up here and you just sort of people gesticulating wildly about where the water goes. And this idea of overconfidence about thinking about our thinking is incredibly important to learning because we are so overconfident. So most people believe that they are above average drivers. Most people, right, believe that they're better looking than the average person in the room. And then there's my favorite. Most people believe that they work harder than their average colleague. Now look, overconfidence is good. I would not be up here giving this presentation to you if I were not just terribly overconfident. But when it comes to learning, overconfidence can be a very bad thing. So often we think we know what we're talking about, right? Or we assume that our learners have really engaged in the material that we've crafted for them so carefully, but they're not thinking about their thinking, or we're not doing enough to think about what actually they've taken away from that. So researchers define metacognition in a number of ways, but it has sort of three very key aspects. One, that we need to plan what we're going to learn. So figuring out targets, figuring out goals. Second, when we're learning, we need to monitor. We need to think about, do I really understand this? Do I really know how a toilet bowl works? Asking yourself simply the question, could I explain this to a child? Is a great way to figure out if you actually know something. And then afterwards, reflecting on that. Thinking, did I really learn this? Right? How could I have learned it better? This is the idea of thinking about thinking, metacognition, very important task. We can also make sure that we model it when we're instructors, when we're bosses, to make sure that other people engage on it as well. So promote feedback. This idea at the very top is similar to metacognition, but a little bit different. This guy is Mark Bernstein. He is a neurosurgeon in Canada, and he used a very basic form of metacognition, this type of monitoring, this type of giving himself feedback. And he did it in a very simple way. After every brain surgery that he'd do, he would just write down what he did wrong. So if he gave a wrong instruction to a nurse, he'd write that down. If he dropped a scalpel, he'd write that down. He saw this tremendous increase in performance. He did it over the course of 10 years, and he saw increases in performance every year simply by just writing down what he did wrong. Mark Bernstein's story also helps us understand why we don't engage in feedback enough, because it's embarrassing often. So he had the experience of literally dropping, I love this story, literally dropping the piece of someone's skull and having to go to the family and being like, we did have an accident today. There was about a quarter-sized piece of your partner's skull, fell on the floor. We had to pick it up and wash it. He described the experience as just totally mortifying. And this is sort of what constitutes feedback, why it's often so difficult both to give and receive. Not long ago, I decided to pick up a basketball tutor because I thought, I needed some feedback. This is my basketball tutor. His name is Dwayne Samuels. He played for the Harlem Globetrotters, if that's familiar to you all, but sort of a professional basketball league in the U.S. It's pretty humorous, for lack of a better term. And what was remarkable to me is that as I mentioned earlier, I've spent my whole life thinking about education, writing about it, speaking to researchers, and I go to this class with Dwayne Samuels. Again, I'm going to stress the embarrassing nature of feedback, because when I would go to my classes with Dwayne Samuels, most of his clients, let's actually go a little further, basically all of his clients were children about the same age as my own children. So, somewhere between 9 and 12. And so I would have to sort of go in and not look at the other parents there or sort of pretend like I was picking up my own child. And yet I have 1 or 2 classes with Dwayne Samuels and I got incredibly better. And it was often these just very little things. Now, just to say at the top, I decided to go to Dwayne Samuels because I am not a very good basketball player. I played with a group of old or middle-aged kind of pot-belly guys and realized that I myself was a little bit more sort of middle-aged and pot-bellied than many of them. But just a little bit of feedback from him was incredibly important, boosted my ability tremendously, largely because it is so hard to look at yourself and see where you do things wrong. So I had a habit of not putting my feet towards the basket. This is basketball 101, something that you learn just when you start playing basketball. But I had never had the insight of watching myself play to remind myself of this very rudimentary bit of information. And this is the power of feedback. This is also the power of tutoring. There's a lot of evidence that tutoring is one of the best ways to learn. In a few moments, we'll talk about the social aspect of learning. But when we have tutors, we have people who are giving us very specific, very targeted feedback, and such an incredible way to learn. And we can use this so much in our own practices. One, if you're giving presentation, if you're have classes, right? Open up spaces where people can give that type of feedback. And also make sure that people have ways to give feedback, those types of venues, whether they're emails or surveys or other types of assessment. Incredible, powerful way to learn. So we're going to move on from this one. I'm getting feedback here right now, and the feedback isn't good.
Maybe. Okay.
Remember to remember. So we're going to have another quiz question here, and that's this one here. How much of this talk will you forget after 24 hours? This is sort of an embarrassing question in a way. So, A, how many people say 25%? 50%? 75%? What's funny about the answers is you guys have been answering correctly, but on this one, most people actually have gotten it wrong. It's only 50%. If I haven't made it totally clear, I am very honored to be here and speak with you, share what I have learned about learning, talk a little bit more about what we know about some of the very basics of research around learning. And I want to be clear that I've gone through these principles to make sure that they're principles that are really rooted in the research. When I spend time with the literature around learning, I feel so often we hear this is brain-based this or neural-based that. What do we really know about learning? What is truly effective about it? And spacing, this idea that you're going to forget, and that you forget at a very regular rate, is one of the oldest bits of evidence in the literature. And you forget around 50% within 24 hours. Clearly very depressing, but we have good news too. This is the forgetting curve, might be familiar to many of you, and you can see here this is day 1, and you can see where about 50% of what you learn is going to be forgotten. But again, I talked about at the beginning that so much of the conventional wisdom around learning is wrong, right? So often see people using highlighters, right? Yellow, green, pink ones. No evidence for them. We often view forgetting as a terrible thing. But forgetting can be very, very powerful for learning. Because when we forget, we have an opportunity to relearn. And when we relearn, we know something for far longer. This is what this forgetting curve shows, right? You forget, then you learn it again, and eventually if it's 4 times in the case of something like this, the forgetting curve in this context is very much based on, if you were not to know any Swahili and I teach you a Swahili word where we can say confidently that you're going to forget it, by the 4th time eventually you know it. When it comes to the practice of teaching, learning, training, development, we need to know that people are going to forget. We need to give them opportunities to re-remember. This goes to something deeper about our brains, and that is, and this is a kind of a quirky thought, but bear with me for a second. You don't actually really forget. There's a fair amount of evidence that every experience that you have is somewhere in your brain. If I were to ask you, do you remember a locker combination from when you were 13, most people would be like, no, that guy's crazy. But if you actually have that information, more so than random chance, people are able to remember, or at least guess at what old locker numbers combinations are. And there's theoretical evidence too, when you think about the number of neurons that we have, it is possible for us to remember every experience that we've had. The real difference is retrieval, our ability to pull something from memory. And to a degree, this is a good thing, right? You want to remember where you parked the car today. You don't want to remember where you parked the car last week. So the more that you pull something from memory, the more that you're able to retrain that information, the more that you're going to be fluent in that information. So again, forgetting is a good thing, and just wanted to give a very concrete example. This guy is Roger Craig, plays on a Jeopardy, which is an incredibly popular show in the US, and he wanted to be on Jeopardy for so long. Even when he was a little kid, he played Jeopardy with his parents, and Jeopardy just has these very basic factual information type questions, like what is the capital of Australia? Some of you guys should think about competing. So Roger Craig comes across the evidence around the learning curve, about the value of forgetting, the degree to which we forget at this very precise rate. He creates his own e-learning program for himself that allows him to relearn things at very regular rates, like who wrote the bridge over the River Kwai. And he goes on to Jeopardy using this bit of science. This happened about 10 years ago. He did so well on his first day, he beat the world record in Jeopardy. He did so well, actually, that he was terrified that they would never ask him back because he had sort of figured out something about the matrix of Jeopardy. But really what he did was use the science of learning to do better at this quiz game. So respect emotions. So I'd like us to sort of take a moment. I know it's early in the morning and I run the danger of having you fall asleep, but I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a moment and think about your childhood bedroom. And do this for about 30 seconds. Think about your childhood bedroom. Think about the color on the walls. Where'd you keep your toys? Where your bed was. Now, if you could open your eyes, that would be great. Now, in laboratory studies, you have people really engaged on this. When they start to think about their past, they tend to lean backwards. And when you encourage people to think about their future, right, where you're going to, retire, and if you're going to sort of, retire in Mallorca, they start to lean forwards. This is a weird thing. So often we believe that cognition, reason, is pure, it's crisp, it's without emotion. And then our bodies, our feelings, right, those two things are totally separate. But that's not the case. In fact, what I made you do, and if you really engaged and closed your eyes and thought about the past, I made you think with your bodies. Right? Your torso engaged in cognition. We're so used to thinking about this, it's such a strange thing. There's ways in which that we can make ourselves think more with our bodies. So these are two chairs. We're going to agree that these two chairs are the same. Don, will you verify?
I can verify that.
Yeah. So in a laboratory study, they had people didn't use chairs, they use another thing, but they had one people give the finger to one chair and wave at the other chair. And the people who gave the finger to the chair thought this was a worse chair and thought that this was a better chair. And essentially this finger did the thinking, right? It shaped their thoughts. Also, earlier when you talked about toilets and you used your hand to explain where the water went through, again, you were thinking with your body. The richer takeaway for this, for us people who care about learning, care about development and training, is that how we feel, how our body is, our emotions, very central to our ability to gain expertise, to gain understanding. So for one, we want learners, we want people engaged in these types of processes to feel safe, to feel comfortable. There are a wonderful study where people, if they held hands with the people sitting next to them, I won't make you engage in this, held hands with the people sitting next to them, did much better on tests than people who did not. Again, they had a feeling of safety. Right? Also, having a sense of connection with your instructor, having a sense of connecting with your colleagues, right, allows us to learn far more effectively. So again, when it comes to learning, we really want to respect emotions. Gain deeper features. This is sort of our eighth principle. When I was a young boy, I sat in church, and the priest grew up in a Catholic family. He always had a set number of pages for his homily, and it was always a good thing because you had a keen sense of like when the end was going to be. This is our eighth principle here, gain deep features. So if you could read this for a moment, it's going to help us think about surface features. This is a simple problem here. So the surface features in this problem are all the details about Mo, right? That this young man has small frame, has these large ears. Surface features, concrete details, they capture our attention when we think about communications, when we think about marketing. These are the details that we pay attention to. But when we learn, and especially when we learn in workplace contexts where you want people to learn something on the learning program and then apply it, whether they're in accounting or in HR, what's important is the deeper feature. And the deeper feature in this is, I did change the slides, is 5 plus 7. And you want to know 5 plus 7, whether you're solving this word problem or if you're going to calculate the tip later tonight at the bar. Right, or any other type of context, right? That is the richer feature that you want to be able to engage in, independent of the surface features. So how do we learn for deeper features? We give you this question: what is the best way to practice? I'm going to explain this just for a moment. So another way to think about a mixed approach is, let's say you want to get better at the piano, and you have 3 practice sessions, and you want to get better at Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven. If you take a mixed approach, that means in your first practice session, you do a little bit of Bach, a little bit Beethoven, and a little Mozart. Right? And then the second day, you mix it up again. Right? Or do you spend all of that first practice session on Mozart, second practice session on Bach, and that third practice session on Beethoven? Right? That's the blocked approach. So how many people think A, mixed approach? So we have some for A, it seems like about half of the room, and B, blocked approach. Great, so it seems like we're split here. The mixed approach is far more effective. There are some details here that should be important to explain. This is for people who have some richer knowledge, right? If you're just beginning to, I don't know, ride a bicycle or practice your golf game or get better at acting, if you're just beginning something, then you should take a blocked approach. But as soon as you have some rudimentary skills, this mixed approach is far more effective. If you guessed for the blocked approach, you are in very good company. It is incredible how much the blocked approach to practice is out there. I recently watched a video of David Beckham practicing some free kicks, and he just did the same kick over and over again. So often I go on to e-learning platforms and I, even rudimentary things like math, right, where people are presented, 7 times 7, 7 times 8, all the sevens together. When the evidence is just incredibly clear that mixing up your practice is a much better way to go. So if I were David Beckham, and I'm not, right, much better doing a free kick, a little bit of dribbling, honing his passing, and then going back to the free kick. In the words of Nate Cornell, a cognitive scientist at Williams, never repeat. Now what's important here is that you are mixing up your practice, right? So it's ABC, ABC, right? You're returning to that practice, but you're just not putting it in, doing it repeatedly. One of the reasons that a interleaving or mixed up approach, the A, is so effective is that it goes back to our principle number 1. It makes learning more active. It is a more difficult way to engage. The other thing that makes a mixed approach to learning more effective is that it makes it easier to see the underlying principle, the deep feature that we really want to know. So if you're learning math, it is helpful then to do word problems and then numerical problems and then have a real world example. When you have them right next to each other, you get a better sense of what really is 5 plus 7. Right? Or if you're skiing, you go down an icy hill and then you go down a hill that has lots of moguls. When you do that, right, repeatedly, right next to each other, you get a better sense of what it is to have that real skill. So again, when you're learning, look for those deep features. Principle number 9, uncover connections. So take a look at this image. What is featured in the image? I'm going to click back to it for a second. How many votes for a amphora, A? A funeral urn, B? Got a couple of votes. And C, a Ming Dynasty vase. Lots of votes, great. How'd you know it was a Ming vase? Memorization? Any votes for memorization? It got sort of, I'm not sure what that was, like a half a vote, but I liked it. B, experience. Some votes for experience. And C, analogy. Some votes for analogy. The correct answer here is C, analogy. So when we go through, and I'm not 100% certain here, but I'm going to explain why I think C is the correct answer here. So memorization, unless some of you work in an antique shop where you see images and handle lots of Ming vases and you study them, right? I'm going to assume that that hasn't been the case, so we're sort of saying memorization isn't it. Experience. This amphora comes from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. It's in sort of one of the back rooms. I'm going to assume that few of the people in this room have sort of seen this firsthand. So analogy is the correct answer because basically what you did is you thought to yourself, I looked at the colors, I looked at the beards, I looked at the shape, and it looked like other things that I think are Ming vases. You engage in a form of pattern recognition. This is incredibly important when it comes to learning. Early on, I took a traditionalist view, arguing for the benefit of knowledge, of facts, how important they are to learn. But fundamentally, that's not why we learn. We don't learn to know the capital of Australia. We know and we learn in order to solve problems, in order to think differently, I learn astronomy because I want to start to think like an astronomer. And when you uncover connections, right, when you think about analogies, you get that richer form of learning. Analogies, I think, have a terrible rap, right? People believe that they're sort of associated with IQ tests, you know, dog is to doghouse like bird is to what. But we use analogies all the time. You use analogies, for instance, to, what's a good example? Oh, Uber, right? People will be like, oh, we need an Uber for childcare, or an Uber, but for haircuts. Right? We're using, I actually think that Uber for haircuts is a good idea, but we use Uber, right? Something that we know, right? That is the thing that we know, and then we try to explain something new or think of something new or come up with a creative idea by using the thing that we know and then applying it in a new way. In the same way that you used your understanding of vases and Chinese art to think and categorize that one item. We can use this idea, this principle of uncovering connections to learn in richer ways. So for instance, if you want to learn more about the oceans, what's important is not to know the temperature of the oceans. It's important to think about connections, to think about analogies, to think about relationships. So what happens when the temperature of the water goes up? That means the water expands. This helps us understand why climate change is so bad for small islands. When we're learning about, let's say we're studying World War II and we think about the speed in World War II, the value of speed when it comes to military action. That helps us then think about other wars and how we can think more richly, right? It helps us understand why the Americans won the Revolutionary War. It helps us think about World War I and the way speed or a lack of speed played a role in that war. Again, we're thinking about analogies. And when we think about Canberra being the capital of Australia, we start thinking about why is it that some nations choose, and the US is another one, for political compromise, some city, whether it's Brasilia or Washington or Canberra, these outlying cities, not a major economic hub, as their political capital, right? It helps us think about sort of history, politics, and geography in new ways. So again, when you're learning, uncover connections, look for systems, look for relationships. This is actually what we want to learn when we're learning. When we want to give our staff, our colleagues expertise, we don't want to give them the facts. We want them to think about how those facts connect to other facts. So this is this 10th principle. What is the most effective length of a pause during a speech or moment of instruction? A, 1 second. Raise your hand. No one for 1 second. Around 2 seconds. 3 seconds or more. So the correct answer for this is 3 seconds or more. I was the person who wrote this quiz question, and if it's not already obvious, I disobeyed this rule at least, I hate to count how many times during this presentation already. The problem here is that we're so excited about the information that we have, we just really want to get it out there. I really know this stuff, I think you should know it too, and so it is incredibly important that I just give that information, dump it out there. Whether you learn it or not, I don't care, just get that information out there. The power of reflection is different than working memory, is different than metacognition. It really comes to the aspect that our brain works on a default network. We need these moments of pause. We need these moments to reflect in order to understand. Now, whatever you think about Barack Obama as the president of the United States, that he's better than Donald Trump or not, he was an amazing orator. And if you watch him or other great orators speak, Winston Churchill, and when they speak incredibly slowly, and they do that because they care that you understand, that you are engaged in the material, that you're absorbing it. And that's why these incredibly long pauses are so important. The issue is, of course, that 3 seconds is long. Awkwardly long. But when we're thinking about learners, when we're thinking about people who are trying to engage material, whether it's ourselves or our colleagues or our staff, we need to make sure that we open these opportunities for them to reflect. So some of that can be simple reflections, little essays that people write. Some that's just making time for people to share their ideas, their key takeaways with their colleagues. And then also making sure that you have these types of longer pauses. So I'm going to take a moment to allow you some questions to quiz me. There we go. And again, thank you so much for giving me the time to talk here.
Thank you, Ulrich. And I'm going to just make a point that if you're in room 2 or 3 over in the hallway, I have got my iPad. I'm watching out for questions from the other side, so beam through to me if you wish. Ulrich, I've got the question I know everyone wants to ask you. You do know it's pronounced Canberra, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So it was a running gag. I was worried about that. Okay.
No, in my defense, I was at a pub last night. The bartender was Australian, and I was worried about this issue, and I said, "How many Brits do you think know the capital of Australia?" And he was like, "None." So.
Okay, any questions for Ulrich? Yeah, Donald.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, putting retrieval at the top of the list, I think, is really important. However, there's an interesting point for us in the audience because the staple interaction in most e-learning is the multiple choice question, and indeed you used many of them here, but this goes completely against the concept of retrieval because you've given the answer away. The brain isn't making the effort to retrieve things, which is true retrieval, it's choosing from a list. This is absolutely 99 out of 100 interactions in e-learning are multiple choice questions. Do you think we should abandon the multiple choice question? I think we should, because it just isn't retrieval at all. Nobody in real life chooses from little lists in their jobs, and yet that's what we all shove into those crappy e-learning programs.
So should we abandon multiple choice, A, yes, or B, yes?
You give me so many options. What's fun about being up here on this stage, right, is that I'm not actually rolling out programs where I have to think about trade-offs. Right? And the multiple choice question, right, is an effort to create a trade-off, which is that it's easier to, on the sort of instructor side, right, on the development side, it's just simply easier to collect that data than to read those essays. I would push back slightly on the idea of a raw lecture, right, where I'm just throwing the information at you. That includes no retrieval. A multiple choice question, I mean, you do, and you can construct them better or worse, right? I mean, what is the capital of Australia is a classic multiple choice question which promotes no richer kind of thought, right? You just simply want to know that factual answer. Certainly, you can create them so they get a little bit better, and they do make people engage, right? So the hypercorrection effect, you know, getting these things wrong, they do take us one step in that direction. So, you know, Don put sort of A, yes, B, yes, I agree, except if you have to sort of roll out programs and you have to deal with these types of trade-offs, you know, the name for this conference is, of course, Learning Technologies, and it gets us at this other thing, and that is the fact that technologies are allowing the evaluation of longer form responses, which is really what we want, to your point, a lot more effective and easier. So I have a lot of hope in those types of programs allowing this richer form of retrieval practice to really take
I'm going to throw a question back to Donald, actually, which is, do you think there is scope for, because I think the trade-off argument is a very good question. Actually, what can we do, given the resource constraints we operate in? But do you think with AI, there is the possibility, or some other technique, that we can use longer form answers, but that not be a resource constraint for us? In other words, you don't have one person trying to work out, do 1,000 people get it? Because there's an algorithm or a machine that can do that work for us.
Yes, so a question like, what is the capital of Australia? If you then have to type in what you know or don't know, you actually type in Sydney, make the mistake, get it correct. That's far more powerful learning experience than getting the list, because you can cheat multiple choice questions quite easily. You get 25% right on if the options are there anyway. But the true answer to this question, I think, is absolutely. the NLP, the understanding of speech.
NLP meaning natural language processing.
Not neuro-linguistic programming,
Yes,
not the Ponzi scheme.
Okay.
The technology is there where it can understand and semantically unpack most answers to questions, but the tools, unfortunately, still push us towards that old technology. So I think the answer is yes there.
Okay, so good. Yes. It's a pause for reflection, everybody.
Good morning. My question is on feedback. So from the data you presented, it seems like that looking at the improvement areas is what moves you ahead. However, the theory, let's say from the past, says it's also important to look at your strengths. So usually when you work with people, you're trying to keep it balanced. Are you trying to suggest with this data that it would be a waste of time looking at the strengths and you should really focus only on the improvement areas?
Feedback itself is a whole field. I think where we're going to get the most amount of gains is from the areas in which we are weak. So independent of the social constraints of feedback, right, which is embarrassing, I don't want to get the feedback. I've given this presentation a number of times to family, to friends. It was only one should never generally read the comments on internet sites, but someone pointed out on the internet site, this guy always says right at the end of sentences. No one had ever told me that. I needed this sort of external feedback that no one else was willing to give me. By the way, I didn't say that at the very beginning because I still do it, and it's an embarrassing habit. Look, we're social beings, and so compliments, knowing where your strengths are incredibly important, and it allows you to also
Let me maybe
negotiate.
be more specific. So then, if you do the reflection for yourself at the end of an activity, would you again suggest that you look only at the things you would improve yourself? So take away all the social interaction, the need for reconfirmation, but really, if you do it yourself, just improvements or both?
I think it's context dependent. So in sports, right, you might want to really know what a strength might be so you can do that more and to take advantage of your opponent. In presentations, that might be the opposite, right, where I have a habit of speaking too quickly, and that is a liability, and I need to know that all around. When I've thought about these kind of learning to learn principles, tried to make them as broad as possible, but clearly there are some things that are going to be different for acting versus thinking about, tax compliance and what that means. So I'm not as much avoiding really directly answering your question, though perhaps it seems that way, as much as saying, yeah, the context is going to make a big difference.
I'm noticing that we are so absorbed in what you're saying, Ulrich. I've noticed that we are just out of time. It is 10:40. Time to wrap up, sadly. Is there any? If you're a father, as I am, do you use this with your children and with your kids? If there's one thing you say to your kids to help them learn better, what is it?
Test yourself.
Test yourself.
Yeah, I was trying to be quite succinct and on time, but the power of testing yourself, retrieval practice, incredibly powerful tool when it comes to learning.
I would totally agree with that. And on the basis of feedback, I play football every Thursday night in goal. I can't do it tonight. Normally, I'd come up here and I'd go down. I'd do a five-a-side every Thursday night. I can assure you that sometimes at work or indeed at play and pleasure, whether you seek feedback or not, you're going to get feedback, especially if you let a goal in on your near post, right? It's going to happen. And that strong feedback often leads to a very rapid performance improvement, even with a certain amount of social embarrassment. I think yesterday we had a great technological overview of where we are at the moment, and that really helped us think to the future. This is fundamental. This is learning. This is what we're here for. We are the Learning Technologies Conference. I'm delighted to have two great keynotes that have really made, well, certainly me, and I hope everybody else here, think about what the heck we're doing in our industry. And Ulrich, I'd like to say once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.